Ready to go, Matt?
Joe, it's live.
Okay, all right. Sorry about that, everybody. Wasn't sure if I was live, but now I am. I know I'm live. So hello, it's my honor. My name's Joe Liebezeit with Portland Audubon to introduce tonight's event, a movie showing of Heceta Bank, Oregon's Hidden Wonder, brought to you by Oregon State University's Marine Studies Initiative and Oregon State Productions, and hosted tonight by Portland Audubon. Again, my name is Joe Liebezeit. I'm the Portland Audubon's staff scientist and conservation manager. And a big part of my job at Portland Audubon is to lead up our coastal marine program, and you'll be hearing a bit about that tonight. First off, I'd like to thank all of you for attending tonight. The last time we checked, we had RSVP registration of over 300 people. So we have a big crowd tonight, and we're really excited. I'd also like to thank the OSU Marine Studies Initiative for collaborating with us on this event. We're excited to have a panel discussion with expert scientists, and we'll also have Portland Audubon's very own 10 Mile Creek Sanctuary Manager, Paul Engelmeyer, on the panel discussion at the end of the movie we broadcast. So definitely stay tuned for that. And we're gonna wait until after the movie for the panel members to introduce themselves. And I'm going to present a few slides about Portland Audubon, and then we'll have Jack Barth, the OSU Marine Studies Initiative Executive Director, talk a little bit about that program, and then we'll jump into the movie. But before we do that, we first would like to honor Oregon's coastal First Nations with a land and sea acknowledgement. So if you've joined us for Nature Night or other Portland Audubon events over the past 2 years, you may have heard us begin the evening by sharing a First Nations acknowledgement statement where we recognize and show respect for Indigenous peoples as the traditional caretakers of the land and sea in a region that we also serve. We do so because it's important to recognize that Portland Audubon is not among the first conservationists. We may have been a conservation group for 118 years, yet the tradition of safeguarding our healthy relationship with the land and earth goes back millennia before our organization was founded. Tonight's event will focus on the marine environment off of Oregon's Central Coast, so I'll acknowledge the coastal tribes that have depended and lived near Oregon's coast and marine waters for thousands of years. This includes the Clatsop, Nehalem Confederated Tribes, Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon, Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and the Coquille Indian Tribe. We acknowledge systemic policies of genocide, relocation, and assimilation that still impact many Native American families today. We thank the descendants of these tribes that are the original stewards and protectors of these lands and waters. And we're grateful for the support of Portland State University's Indigenous Studies, Nation Studies program for helping inform this First Nations acknowledgement. We also wish to thank Portland Audubon community members for supporting our evolution to be inclusive of all who appreciate birds, nature, and the environment we all depend on. Being inclusive and truly coming together for nature, as our logo says, also means that we work together to dismantle racism and systems of oppression, and to center diverse voices we have often left out, and to speak out against injustice wherever we find it. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna go ahead and present a few slides, and I'm gonna give you a little bit more information about Portland Audubon, OSU's Marine Studies Initiative, and to set the stage for tonight's film. So Portland Audubon is one of the oldest conservation groups in Oregon. We were founded back in 1902, and our core kind of mission and goals are to protect wildlife and habitat statewide. And also a key thing is educating people and connecting people with nature. And in this photo here, you see two of our seabird community scientists monitoring seabird colony there at Heceta Head. Portland Audubon's marine conservation priorities, I'll go over, but we have a long history of doing marine related conservation work on the coast. And in this photo, you can see here on the right side of your screen is our first president, William Finley, back in somewhere around 1902, with Henry Bowman climbing up to these poor common murres up on Three Arch Rock and about to take a photo of them. And they did many expeditions around Oregon, and through their work, they lobbied to protect many places in Oregon, including some of our coastline habitats like Three Arch Rock, which eventually became part of U.S. Fish and Wildlife's National Wildlife Refuge out on the coast. Moving to today, our priorities are to protect seabirds. And one of our core species we work on a lot, which we'll probably hear more about tonight, is the marbled murrelet. We have been active working on the species for decades, and we're one of the groups that helped get it listed on the Endangered Species Act. We also are working currently on helping protect Oregon's iconic rocky habitats. We've been involved from the get-go on helping designate the marine reserves and marine protected areas in Oregon. There's 5 of them and associated marine protected areas in our nearshore waters. And they're coming up for review in a couple of years. So we'll be definitely keep on working on that program. Some emerging issues we're working on is Oregon is about to start working on estuary management plans, updating them from back in the 1980s. And so we'll be working on that issue, and a key species associated with them is eelgrass, which is very important for birds and other wildlife and for carbon sequestration. And then finally, as we move along this decade, renewable energy, in particular wind power off our coast, is going to be more and more of a reality. So we'll be tracking that issue. So I encourage folks listening in today to reach out to us, myself and Paul Engelmeyer. We're the Coastal Marine Program basically at Audubon, to get more information and to get involved. Here's just a map of the layout of the Central Coast, and I wanted to point out a few things. Of course, the Heceta Bank is off about 15 to 25 miles off the coast here. But first, I want to just point out Portland Audubon's 10 Mile Creek Sanctuary, which I have my cursor on. Hopefully you can see it. The small parcel here, about 216 acres. And that's where Paul Engelmeyer does our land management. You can see it's sandwiched between these wilderness areas, Cummins Creek and Rock Creek Wilderness. And as part of the Siuslaw kind of National Forest, which is a very important area for marbled murrelets, and going out into the ocean, because connectivity is a big part of what we do. The land-sea connection is very important for us in our conservation work. And right off the coast is the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve and MPAs, and that's the largest MPA and marine reserve system in Oregon. And then again, we have our important bird areas, which are Audubon and BirdLife International designated spots of hotspots of importance for birds. They don't afford any protection, but they just signify those important areas. And of course, the Heceta Bank and the associated Stonewall and Perpetua Bank, which we call the Heceta Bank IBA complex, is a really important hotspot for seabirds. So there's documentation that on single visits to the Heceta Bank area by researchers and by pelagic birders, at any one time, there have been hundreds of black-footed albatross documented, thousands of pink-footed shearwater. In one case, in one visit, 10,000 Cassin's auklets were seen, and that's a species of concern. More recently, you've heard about some of the seabird die-offs. That's been one of the birds that's been directly impacted by that. And then also some very rare birds that you might not often think about being in Oregon waters, like the short-tailed albatross, can be found there at certain times of the year. The upwelling of nutrient-rich water in that region, of course, is what we're going to hear about tonight, and it helps these birds survive, as well as a lot of other marine life, which we're going to hear about. One last slide before I'm going to send this over to Jack Barth to talk about the Marine Studies Initiative at OSU is just to show you how seabirds from literally all over the world come to this system off of our coast, including Heceta Bank. It's part of the much larger California current system. That's, again, a very important hotspot for biological activity. So really, if you think of it, the Heceta Bank is of global international importance for seabirds and other marine life. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jack Barth.
Thank you, Joe. My name is Jack Barth. I'm the Executive Director of OSU's Marine Studies Initiative, and I'd like to welcome you. One of our missions is, much like Portland Audubon, is to share what we know about the ocean and what things we're studying and the challenges ahead. So it's really a program at OSU across the whole state to advance excellence in marine-related education, research, and outreach and engagement. The next slide, please. And much like Portland Audubon, we have a mission to create a healthy future for our ocean and the planet through what we call transdisciplinary research. And that's where we engage with communities, with Indigenous people to understand the issues and to engage early on. And then we do research and education around that. And we really want to get the next generation of students excited about helping maintain our healthy planet and our healthy ocean. Next slide, please. We've been working hard on creating a new facility in Newport, Oregon. This is at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center, where we sail many of the vessels, some of which go out to Heceta Bank. And this facility is a one-of-a-kind 72,000 square feet. It's the first big investment by the university, again, since 1964. We're proud of the labs. We have an innovation lab where we'll build equipment and help us study the ocean. We have an artist studio, so we're trying to bring in the arts and humanities and really open up the ocean realm to anybody with any kind of interest. And you'll notice a interesting feature of a tsunami evacuation ramp that we built into it. So it's really a fun place. It's completed, but not quite open because of the COVID challenges. We'll welcome you later this year, we hope. And then our final slide is just summing up to welcome you to this event. We're proud to partner with Portland Audubon and Oregon State Productions to bring you this film. And there's a couple ways you can find out more about us. Go back to you, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Appreciate that. And I think with that, we're off to present the film to you. So behind the scenes is Portland Audubon employee Matthew Hushbeck, and he's going to get the movie going for you. Thank you.
Well, my name is Bill Piercy. I've been at OSU since 1960. I was one of the 5 founding members of the Department of Oceanography back then. And now I guess I'm a professor emeritus in CEOAS, College Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. And most of my research has been on what we call marine nekton, fishes in the ocean, but also squid and shrimp and other things like that. So I've had a really good time here. Great career and a lot of fun.
The rugged coastline near Cape Perpetua is known for its spectacular scenery and abundant wildlife. But the landscape that has fascinated scientist Bill Piercy for most of his career lies below the water. 35 miles offshore from Cape Perpetua, there is a deepwater bank known as Heceta Bank.
You wouldn't see it, just looking out over the blue expanse. It's one of the most productive areas on the coast. It's a hotspot for biological productivity. We talk about our successful fisheries in Oregon. Heceta Bank is the place.
So it's an extremely productive area because of these 2 things: unique position and the currents coming from the north during the summertime, accelerating upwelling. So it's a very productive area.
Heceta Bank has become one of the most studied features off of the Oregon coast. But that wasn't always the case. In the 1980s, Bill Piercy became one of the first scientists to get an up-close look at the underwater world of this structure.
And in 1987 and 88, I was privileged to make some of the first submersible dives off Heceta Bank. And it was amazing. It was truly amazing.
Brown above. Yeah, quite here they come into view pretty well.
There was this huge concentration of fish, very abundant, and high diversity. And rocky pinnacles on top of that bank were just amazing habitats for big, what we call macroinvertebrates. Things like sponges and crinoids and basket stars just blanketed these rocks. Big things like that.
The submerged structure, Heceta Bank, is unique on the West Coast. It transforms the waters around it, driving biological productivity and making nearby habitats thrive. Its effects are felt 35 miles away on the shore and even deep in the coastal forests. It draws birds and mammals from across the globe to its thriving waters. You're about to learn the science behind what makes Heceta Bank tick. A unique blend of geology, oceanography, and biology that has shaped a natural wonder unlike anything else along Oregon's coast. The productivity of Heceta Bank is driven by its geology. And to understand what makes it so special, you must first learn about the forces that created the uplifted structure of the bank.
So the way the ocean works is you get the coast, and the bottom drops off kind of slowly, and then it hits the continental shelf break, and it just plummets down to the abyss. And the width of that is called the continental shelf. And what Heceta Bank does is it widens that continental shelf to over double the width. So it kind of sticks out into the ocean from the shore.
The offshore area of the Pacific Northwest from Cape Mendocino up to Vancouver Island is a subduction zone. And that essentially means that the Juan de Fuca plate is diving underneath North America. North America is acting like a snow shovel and just peeling all the sediment off the incoming plate and just kind of, just like a snow shovel, just kind of smushing it into a disorganized pile. It's a big attractant for rockfish because there are just rocks everywhere, so it's a very popular spot for rockfish that are looking for cover, and there's sort of a halo around that of where the juvenile rockfish live. But it's also, directly abuts big sandy areas where flatfish and other sort of sand-loving, biota live. And so it's kind of it's a very rich area that sort of has it all.
Geology is the first key to the puzzle of Heceta Bank's productivity. But another major factor is the oceanography, the way the movement of the currents, upwelling, and waves interact with the physical structures. The first documented mention of the bank came from Bruno Heceta, a Spanish explorer that gave his name to the structure. Heceta Bank, or Heceta Bank as many fishermen and scientists now call it, was first described by the captain for the noticeable change in the watercolor. This was likely due to the high levels of chlorophyll, which jump-starts the whole food chain.
The color of the ocean is very obvious that this is an area that has more plankton. If you're in a commercial airline flying down the coast, you're gonna see it. We fly satellites that can measure the actual chlorophyll, and there's a big pool sitting over the bank. It's Heceta Bank and Stonewall Bank. We call that the Heceta Bank Stonewall Complex. And it's that area where you see high amounts of chlorophyll in the water from phytoplankton blooming. We see a really productive upper ocean where fishermen can go out and catch fish. So it's this special area. And the reason it is special is because of that underwater topography and the way the currents interact with it. But what's amazing is the amount of structure that's there, both in the vertical, different layers, warm waters, cold waters, productive waters, not so productive, And then further, there's this set of currents that are being swept around the banks, and it's just a swirling, active area. So we know a lot about upwelling, how the wind blows and it brings up cold water from below and those nutrients. And what the bank does is it restructures that, and it actually enhances that upwelling in that area. So over the bank, we know there's a bigger area of colder water, a bigger area of nutrients, and a bigger place for plankton blooms. As that southward flow comes barreling down the coast, it encounters this obstacle, which is the bank. And oceanic flows don't like to go over things because the water is layered, and it just takes too much energy or momentum to go over something. So what it does is it goes around the outside, and the bank presents that obstacle. Because the bank is wider and the flow goes around it, it actually amplifies the upwelling. So there's more cold water in a bigger area over the bank. And you can see in these satellite images, there's a big cold part over the bank. And that cold water's come up from below and it's full of nutrients. And it's just the perfect recipe for a phytoplankton bloom. And it happens right over the bank there. And you can see it spreading out from the coast. It goes out 40, 50 miles, and it squirts offshore with all this rich plankton mass. So in this image, we're using bright reds to indicate where chlorophyll is high. With your naked eye from the coast, what you'd see is this green-brown water, this sort of soup. That's all good stuff. This is the plankton that's at the base of the food web. So that same wide area temperature is covered with plankton. It's a big, wide area. You can see in the bright reds here, it swirls around the bank. In fact, some of that water gets shot offshore and is providing nutrition or plankton to the offshore communities.
And that's the water that's so rich in nutrients that starts the food chain. First with phytoplankton, little plants that need the nutrients and carbon dioxide, and they grow and they get bigger. And then you have little zooplankton, things like copepods, euphausids that eat these little plants. And then they're the fodder for bigger things like little fishes and like anchovy, for example, and sardine, and little rockfishes and juvenile fish of all kinds. And those then are eaten by the bigger predators like salmon, bigger rockfish, mackerel, other species that are common off Heceta Bank.
One of the most fascinating effects that Heceta Bank has on the food web is how it interacts with offshore deep ocean species. In these cross-section charts, you can see concentrations of different sizes of fishes near the bank. Because of this interaction, it creates a virtual buffet of forage fishes for predators of all types.
So here you can see in the top panel at low frequency, near the surface, there's forage fishes like anchovies, herring, sand lance that are close to the surface, and they're usually found just offshore of a front off of Heceta Bank. This shows the animals that are smaller, like curly euphausids, little shrimp-like animals that are about an inch or so long, very abundant off the Oregon coast, in offshore waters. And these animals migrate vertically. They go down in the daytime, come up at night. And when this happens, a lot of times they're wafted inshore and they get trapped behind Heceta Bank here. They're very, very vulnerable to any kind of predators in here. And besides the euphausids, myctophids or lanternfish are often found in big concentrations right off Heceta Bank.
The oceanography and the geology of Heceta Bank are the engines that drive the biological productivity and amazing diversity of the region. The bank attracts a wide range of species, which in turn attracts the scientists who study them.
Heceta Bank being a rocky, deep-water rocky bank that extends up from 500 meters up to 70 meters, it's within the depth range of many important commercial species and non-commercial species of fish and invertebrates along our coast. Again, you kind of have this change of habitat types as you go from the middle of the continental shelf up onto the eastern flank of the bank and then over the top of this rugged ridge that forms the top of the bank and then down through these boulder and cobble habitats. And as you go from one habitat to the next, you see major shifts in the fish communities.
And when you actually look at some of the footage that the remotely operated vehicles and submarines bring in, you see that thick green water, and you see just thousands of baby rockfish and other organisms there. And one of the things that we discovered working with folks on the coast there is that those fish are a really important food source for a lot of predators, including other rockfish and salmon. So when the Chinook salmon come in, on their way to the rivers, they are chowing down on those juvenile rockfish. And you can see that if you go to the cleaning stations and open the stomachs of the fish as they're being cleaned. And so what that means is that high productivity on the bank is getting transferred all the way up into the coast range. The Chinook are also going south all the way down into California and taking those nutrients that they're picking up off the bank down into the Klamath and the Sacramento and so on. So there's this connectivity that happens within Oregon, but it actually extends all the way down the coast.
So the marine birds are a good indicator that there's food available in that area. Heceta Bank seems to be, a retention area for productivity and relatively high energy transfer up the food chain to marine birds and mammals. And there's oftentimes, I think of it as one of those locations that's sort of an oasis, where when conditions, it might be a low food production year for the birds, and you don't see many birds elsewhere, but they're still in relatively high abundance at Heceta Bank. One of the species that I study are short-tailed albatrosses that nest in Japan. And we put tracking devices on those birds in Japan, and we have tracked them all the way over to the Oregon coast and to Heceta Bank. The influence of the bank is beyond the spatial extent of the bank itself. We see not only high bird abundance and diversity over the bank and toward the outer edges, but also near shore, and then also at times to the south.
If I'm looking for birds, I'll go down to Neptune State Park and then look in that near shore. And if we're lucky, we'll see them on the water. And so, of course, what they'll do is, since they feed on forage fish, and it could be juvenile rockfish, herring or sardines, or sand lance, or a suite of species in the buffet. There's something happening on the ocean floor that creates this upwelling and diversity that kickstarts the food web. Birds are here consistently. So to me, it's pretty exciting that you can have these specialists from multiple disciplines zeroing in on special areas.
The gardens are fertilized in the ocean by upwelling. So upwelling is one of the characters that's very common for most of the whale species that we study that are migratory and take place along the California, Oregon, Washington coasts. Offshore here, the Heceta Banks has been an important area most years for quite a few animals, and we have a bit of evidence that the same animals are returning year after year. So I think when whales find something that works for them, they continue to exploit that. Productivity can be very, very different all around the world. And here off the Oregon coast, we get upwelling that's advective from winds that bring cold, nutrient-rich water to the surface, gets it into the sunlight, and makes it more productive for the whole food chain from phytoplankton up to whales. And then you have physical features like the banks, Heceta Banks. So those places have special importance because of the assurance of having upwelled water most years.
The biological abundance of Heceta Bank draws an array of species and the scientists who study them. But the area also draws fishing fleets that come to harvest a range of species in the waters near the bank, as well as those areas impacted by the productivity the bank creates.
We live in a really complex world, and this job is basically the same job it was thousands of years ago, using nets, traps, and hooks to catch this great protein for people and bring it back. That simple mission is something that I enjoy. I feel like I could see where I fit into the planet when we're hauling a trap full of fish or crab. It's a good feeling.
We actually work with a number of local fishermen, and that's the spot they go. You know, they sail out of either Newport or the Florence area, and they go right to that region because they know it's highly productive.
Certainly fish like structure, right? And that's a big structure, right? I think it's one of the biggest structures on the offshore structures on the slope in the fishing areas off the west coast. There's a long history of fishing around the bank, on the bank. The mix of species that's available to the fleet is maybe more available here than other available to the fleet. Because really, for the marketplace, you want to have a mix of species.
I look at a marine chart and I usually get excited because I associate so many good experiences from the places I see, and certainly these banks are important. They're part of the basis of the richness of this part of the coast. On the east side of the bank, there's a big horseshoe-shaped area fed by the bank and the richness of the bank. And if the crab are in deep water, you're probably going to find quite a few of them just inside the banks. On the west side of the banks, there's a super steep drop-off. So there's kind of a funneling in the depth curve there. So I think sometimes that's the very best part of the coast that I know of to find sable fish.
Fishermen have long recognized that the banks and the shallow areas that they support around them give them a large area to catch fish. A lot of us that have been treated real well by our industries, I guess, feel like we need to either give a little back or protect what's there or fix what isn't somehow, and do what we can to work with research part of the equation to make it more sustainable.
We've done a lot of collaborative research in this lab, and you realize that first, fishermen know how to catch fish a lot better than scientists do, and they know a lot about the environment and all of the complexities of how our coastal systems work. And so it's really a nice, beneficial relationship when we're able to do that collaborative work.
I've worked with UC Santa Cruz, OSU, NOAA, the state of Oregon, and it's something that I like to be involved in. It's great catching millions of pounds of wonderful wild protein, but I want to also contribute to the knowledge base in some small way.
And I think it's just important that the fishermen and the coastal community and people in general realize how important and productive this bank is to not only the fishing community, but just to the productivity of the Oregon coastal area in general.
While modern fishermen, scientists, birders, and naturalists are drawn to Heceta Bank and the surrounding areas enhanced by its productivity, we also know that the very first humans in the Americas were likely drawn to this same area tens of thousands of years ago.
As sea level is lower, and this happens because to make ice the size of Canada, the water budget comes out of the ocean and lowers the world's oceans. But it would have exposed a tremendous amount of coastal landscape that the people that are ancestral to modern Native Americans would have been living out there, undoubtedly, in this place that's the highest resource area concentration on Oregon's coast. One idea that's pretty popular right now in archaeology in North America is that the first peoples to come into the Americas may have walked and boated their way down the coastline of the Pacific. Now, the evidence for that is very difficult to put your hands on because a lot of it is probably offshore. The banks that are out there, Heceta Bank, Perpetua, Stonewall banks. These are ground fishing areas that are sort of raised rocky promontories out there. During the last glacial period, as sea level was lower, this would have actually been a small mountain range. So it's a chain of mountains that would have run roughly north-south. And on the east side, on the inland side of it, there would have been a large bay. And this bay is larger than San Diego Bay and smaller than San Francisco Bay. So it sets up these really unique environmental aspects of Oregon's coast that we really didn't understand that much until we started to get into the data and put all the maps together. And then as we've begun to do more of our work with the Nautilus and other vessels, we begin to see into the seafloor, and we're now reconstructing what the river systems are like. We can see actual signatures of river channels, and piecing together this past environment has been really important. And a place like the Heceta Bank has really been a focus for our work so far.
Heceta Bank is now one of the most researched areas on the West Coast. And while there's a lot that we know about how it was created and what drives its productivity, there's still more to learn. And in an era of rapid change that includes ocean acidification, hypoxia, dead zones, and climate change, the data collected over decades on this spot is essential to our understanding of a changing ocean.
So one of the reasons we know so much about Heceta Bank is because of oceanography at Oregon State University, getting out there in ships, making measurements. And it's absolutely imperative that we keep that set of measurements going.
These long-term time series provide some of the most important information we have to look at changes in ocean condition, how that impacts not only these natural resources like marine birds, but also the fisheries too.
So the fishing industry, you want to embrace the kind of science that I can give you for planning purposes, if nothing else, right? So I think the fishing industry is probably embracing the scientific side probably more than ever.
Scientific ecological knowledge and local ecological knowledge are on a merging path. But the changing climate is a big concern. You know, the lowering pH, acidification, the rising temperatures and associated changes with that. We need to adapt to these changes, and I'm certain that the scientific community can help us do that.
Well, I think our initial research was kind of pioneering research on Heceta. And so that is, as I say, very gratifying to see that this is something that we kind of initiated and it's continuing. And quite frankly, I've lost track of everything that's going on there now. It's an area that's sort of bustling with research.
Oregon is an ocean state, and we all identify with the ocean. It does, amazing things for us, and it absolutely stabilizes our environment. It provides food, it provides recreation. It does a whole number of things for us. We need to keep that going and have that be a healthy marine ecosystem. And by making these measurements, we can see early signs of change. We can also learn areas that are special, and Heceta Bank is definitely a special place.
Most of the life on the planet is under that surface. There's incredible diversity. It's huge, but it's finite, and we need to take care of it. It's a great big garden.
All right. Well, that was amazing. I'm going to now introduce Jack Barth, although he's already kind of talked a little bit about himself. I'm going to say a little bit more about Jack, and then he's going to pass it off to everyone else in our panel to give a brief introduction before we get into the questions. But while they're doing that, please listen to them, obviously, and learn about what they're doing, their research and their activities, but also think about questions you might want to ask and drop them in the chat box, and we'll get to those after that introduction. So Jack Barth is a professor of oceanography in Oregon State University's College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. His research seeks to understand the spatially and temporally variable circulation, water mass structure, and ecosystem response in coastal waters. Basically, he's an oceanographer. His present research includes a focus on the characteristics and formation of low oxygen zones off Oregon, which a lot of you have probably heard about and are concerned about. And that's an issue that's impacting the entire coast and therefore the whole nearshore food web. Jack, as you mentioned before, is also the executive director of the OSU's Marine Studies Initiative. So with that, Jack, I don't know if you want to add anything more, but I'll pass it over to you to send it on to everyone else.
Great, thanks, Joe. And I'll just add that I've been working in Oregon waters for about 30 years now. And I like to say we used to go right by the bank because it was too complicated to figure out. But then we took on the challenge, and you saw some of the results tonight. And I'm super excited to hear your questions and talk with all the panelists. So I'd like to see if Bill is there, Bill Piercy.
Well, I am there, but I don't see me.
So maybe hit that little, turn on the video.
Bill, I just invited you to start your video. Perfect.
There we go. Okay.
There you go. You want to introduce yourself, Bill?
Yeah, I'm Bill Piercy, retired professor of oceanography a long time ago, came in 1960. And been working on things like marine nekton, which are the fishy things like fishes and squid and salmon and things like that. And I've been doing research for a long time and got this video started. And I guess that's about it. Thanks.
All right, let's hand off to Lindsay, Adrian.
Hi everyone. I am a faculty research assistant at Oregon State University in the College of Forestry, and my project is called the Oregon Marbled Murrelet Project. So we are studying space use and reproductive success of marbled murrelets along the central coast of Oregon. And I think next up is Paul.
Good evening. Thank you for all attending this. And I'm Paul Engelmeyer, and I manage the Audubon Sanctuary, as well as Wetlands Conservancy land in Halsey Bay, Yaquina Bay, and Beaver Creek. And I have been dealing with ocean conservation issues through the Pacific Fishery Management Council, Habitat Committee, Salmon Advisory Panel. But I mostly deal with watershed restoration at the Central Coast scale, 1 million acres. So I've been in the middle of these issues for over 25 years. And I really appreciate this panel. To be a part of this, this is great. And great job on the video, Bill. And Annie, do you want to jump in there next?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Annie Lindgren. I am faculty here at Portland State University. I am also the director for the Center for Life in Extreme Environments. So a lot of what happens off our coast is indeed quite extreme. So it's a natural place for me to spend some time. I'm a deep sea biologist, primarily interested in squids, but also fishes. And my connection to Heceta Bank is really those offshore animals living in some pretty strange waters. So it's quite a pleasure to be here and get to learn and discuss all of this with the rest of the panel. And with that, I'll turn it over to David.
Thanks, Annie. My name is David Baker, and I'm with Oregon State Productions, and we're a part of the university that works on news and research communications. So I have the tremendous pleasure of working with all different sorts of researchers, and usually it starts with an email or a phone call, as it did with Bill, and that leads us on an adventure for a year or so where we get to learn a lot about a lot of different technology and habitats and natural resources. So this was a year-long adventure that that we all spent together, and it was great to be a part of it. And let's see, Amanda, I think you're next.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay? My name is Amanda Gladdox. I'm a Fisheries Extension faculty member with Oregon Sea Grant and Oregon State University Extension Service. I'm based up in Astoria, and my work ranges from outreach and community education to collaborative research with the fishing community, coastal community members, and as well as visitors to the coast. And that can take the shape of things like first aid training for fishermen, or consumer education about seafood that's caught in Oregon, as well as collaborative work on fisheries and wildlife interactions. And actually my background and training is mostly with seabirds. So I've worked on albatross bycatch reduction and mitigation research and outreach over the years. And my connection to Heceta Bank, I was thinking back, like, what was the first experience I had personally? And it was doing peregrine surveys at Heceta Head, actually, and seeing my first ocean sunfish basking at the top of the water and just being so confused of what is this weird creature. But it's carried through. I've done tons of at-sea seabird surveys across the bank, and it's always a huge highlight of those trips to have some time on Heceta Bank. So excited to be here, and what a cool panel. Excited to hear people's questions.
All right, everybody. Well, thanks for those introductions to yourself. I think it was cool to hear about all the work you guys are involved in. So let's now switch to questions. And I think the first one I want to ask from our long list of questions, and I do want to say to everybody in the audience that we may not get to all your questions. There's quite a few coming up, but we'll do our best to cover as much as we can. The first question, let's direct to David Baker, the filmmaker, and just say, what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced for this film and maybe other films in conveying scientific information to a general audience?
Well, yeah, I think it's always a challenge to try and find a story arc, particularly in a longer piece, between long sections of information, because you don't really hit pause or anything to process the information as you do when you're reading it. So we kind of do that through characters. So trying to find different characters is a way to do that. And in this case, Bill, who came to us with the story, we had to talk him into being kind of the main character for the piece and kind of map the story to his career a little bit. So he was a little baffled when we asked him to bring his old car to the coast and follow him around for a day. But I think he's a good sport about it, and that really helped tie the film together.
Great, thanks a lot, David. All right, well, I have a question. This one might be for Annie. It says, what is the coolest animal living down in the deep sea and living in low oxygen water? So maybe a few people can answer that, but I think it sounds like Annie has done a lot of deep sea research. So, and maybe there's going to be a squid involved. I see a squid on your wall behind you. So let's see what you have to say.
It's true. I do have quite a bit of marine paraphernalia behind me. This was my staging for teaching Intro to Marine Biology remotely in the fall. Keep the students engaged. So I will give you a couple of answers. I definitely have to say, one of the really cool things about the deep waters off of our coast is that a lot of folks don't realize, but there is a completely naturally occurring body of low oxygen water full of animals. We know very little about how they survive there. So one of them is, some of you may have heard about the vampire squid. It's not a squid or an octopus, but it's a pretty interesting animal because as an adult, it lives all the time in almost zero oxygen, and we have no idea how. It's a mobile animal, it's a predator, it's cruising around, and we have no idea how it's capable of surviving. So that's something I'm really interested in. However, I will say that for my first research cruise off the coast here, when I took 7 undergraduates from PSU, I had a very similar experience, Amanda, to you, with the first time that sunfish floats up and you're like, oh my gosh, what is this? And then it followed us around all day as we were trawling. So that was pretty fantastic as well.
Great. Does anyone else want to chime in about a favorite critter story in the deep sea? No? All right. Well, okay. I hear someone say
I was
something.
going to say that the abundance of fishes that you hardly ever see, things called macrurids and snailfish and things like that. They're typically deep water fish. And other things that live down there that people rarely see, sleeper sharks, big sharks and things like that are deep water too. So, down to, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 meters.
Great, thanks. All right, new question. How should a special place like Heceta Bank be protected and sustained? Is good harvest management sufficient? Should it be a large protected area with limits on the types of fishing or other development? Paul, do you want to take a crack at that, and anyone else can follow up?
In the video, Jack may have mentioned something along the lines of, it's one of the most studied sites on the West Coast. And with the past, hate to say, actually, it was a pretty significant draconian management to recover rockfish as a result of depleting these rockfish. And that's a coast-wide effort that happened, and huge closures, and Heceta Banks was closed to trawling, and a list of things like that. So you've got some areas at a oceanscape scale that are ecological hotspots that could be deemed a research reserve. And so I look at that as NOAA, ODFW, in partnership with the feds and the fishing community, could actually acknowledge that and had one of many locations up and down the coast established as research sites, because these reference areas, whether you're in the terrestrial side or in the ocean, our footprint and fingerprints are just about everywhere, to be honest. And so having spots set aside, from my perspective, does make ecological sense, and it will fill a information gap over time.
I'll chime in a little bit. That the top 200 meters of Heceta Bank and Stonewall Banks are protected. They're essential fish habitat areas by the Fisheries Management Council now. So in a sense, there's no trawling there, but there are other kinds of fishing that goes on there, like pot fishing and longline fishing, which is apparently illegal. But the Oregon is the only state on the West Coast that does not have some offshore area in some sort of form of protection, like a national marine sanctuary. And it seems to me that it would be good to have something like that, but that's in federal waters. So to do that, you have federal administration come in and administer that. You can't do it just by, state standards. But it would be wonderful to have an extended protected area from Cape Perpetua, which is a marine protected area, all the way offshore into Heceta. There's a bunch of reasons for this. So you have spawning fish like rockfish that spawn on Heceta Bank. And during the wintertime, when you have onshore winds, their juveniles are wafted inshore. And that's where the nursery grounds is. So you have a connection between the spawning grounds and the nursery grounds inshore. So it's a system that would be wonderful to have protection all the way from the inshore, Cape Perpetua, offshore to the boundary of Heceta Bank. That's a dream, but that's something we should shoot for.
Well, we have a new administration now, so we'll see how that goes. And I think that there was another question we had that's related to this, and I think Bill may have answered this, is someone asked about bottom dragging for trawling for fish in Heceta or Heceta Bank. And you're saying, Bill, that is there's in the essential fish area that's not allowed. Is that all dragging, like even pelagic dragging, or?
Not above 200 meters. They can trawl now from 200 meters down. I think it was 3,800 meters, something like that, on the west side of Heceta Bank.
So that is bottom.
That was just open, a year ago.
Okay.
Yeah, can I chime in on that?
Yeah, please.
So Paul was mentioning that there were some major conservation efforts put in to recover rockfish species, and one of those was a large closed area that went kind of all the way along the coast, along a certain depth range that Bill was talking about. Last year, that rockfish conservation area was reopened, But in that same process, there were a series and really a network of other conservation areas that were designated or continued. So that core area on top of Heceta Bank remains closed to bottom trawling. But like you said, there's other fisheries that take place in and around that area. Yeah, so hopefully that clarifies a little bit.
Thanks. I want to move on a little bit. We might come back to fishing, but I think that was a really good series of questions and answers. So I want to focus on marbled murrelets a little bit here and maybe direct this towards Lindsay. I know that marbled murrelets spend a lot of their time in the nearshore waters foraging, but someone was asking, do they make their way out into the Heceta Bank waters, which, as we heard, are very productive? Are they concentrated out there too in certain times of the year? So maybe you can fill us in on that.
Sure, yeah. Well, on my project, we put radio tags on the birds during the breeding season. And so we follow them from May until August or September. And during that time, what we found is that the birds do stay pretty close to shore. We've found them up to about 5 miles offshore, but usually they're even closer than that. The big unknown is what the birds do in the winter. We really don't have much information. We do think that they move offshore, but we really don't have details about that. So it's entirely possible that they're moving offshore. They eat forage fish, like species that were mentioned in the film. But they also eat euphausids, krill. And so they could be getting those in close to shore or farther offshore. We just don't know a lot about what they do during the winter.
Thanks a lot. Does anyone else have any follow-up on that? Any other seabird people on the panel? All right, well, let's move to a question. Maybe this one will be focused for Jack. How do oceanographers know what the ocean flow is like in the Heceta Bank region? I know that there was a little bit about that in the movie, but maybe you can elaborate more.
Sure, and I'll just touch on why we think, and as Paul mentioned, this research reserve. It's really, you got to get out there. So we got to get in a research vessel, and at least from Newport, it's a couple hours steam down to the south, and we don't always have a vessel at our disposal. You got to have a big enough one. Certainly for Lindsay's studies, and for sure in the winter, you better have a pretty big vessel. So we got to get out there, and we use a couple main ways. We can lower instruments down into the water, measure the temperature and the salinity. That tells us the density of the water. You can actually see those layers tilting, and they want to move back to their flat shape through what's the rotation of Earth. That actually causes a current that goes along those layers. And so we can diagnose what the underwater currents are doing just by lowering instruments down. But maybe the coolest way is we do it acoustically. So the ship comes along and we send a pulse of sound down, and it bounces off the zooplankton and comes back. And we measure the shift of that sound, the Doppler shift, just like a train approaching you or going away. And from that, we can tell the currents. And then what we do is with that pulse, we chop it up every 2 or 3 meters, and we get a complete profile of the ocean currents. So the horizontal currents from the very surface to the sea floor. And we basically can get a 3-dimensional picture of what's going on. And that's how we discovered that the really strong southward flow that Bill and I both mentioned runs smack into that bank, and it swirls offshore, it recirculates, and think of a big rock in a river where there's a back eddy behind there. It's kind of a quieter area. And so you pump in the nutrients, and the currents allow that everything to grow there. It's really a special place.
Thanks, Jack. There's a question from one of the participants. and this is getting back towards protecting the area, the discussion we had earlier, but they say, what about expanding the UNESCO Cascade Head Biosphere Reserve South to include Cape Perpetua and Heceta Bank? And then also someone mentioned this 30 by 30 sustainable plan. So if anyone on the panel wants to take that on, perhaps Paul or someone, maybe start with Paul and move from there.
Well, I think that the time is right. When we're looking off in the distance, we realize that resiliency is the word that's come out in the last 5 years. And when you look at how do we have a resilient ocean, because we can't back up and say, oh, we made some mistakes in the past, but we can move forward with marine protected areas more at an oceanscape scale, do better than we're doing in federal waters. So that's one piece of the strategy that could incorporate, whether it's a biosphere reserve link or research reserve or a California current wide research network. These are things that we could do. We need to engage with our policymakers and agencies and commit, because things are changing right before our eyes, and it's time for action. So there's a 30 by 30, you can Google that up, and there's a direction coming in discussion with Bonamici and some of the delegation about these ocean conservation strategies, including blue carbon, which deals with not only ocean, but in our estuaries as well. So these are opportunities for communities and scientists to help lead the discussion and support the vision of a resilient nearshore and federal waters.
Does anyone else on the panel want to elaborate? Sounds like Jack did.
Well, I mean, I'd just like to do a hello to Bruce Byers, who asked that question about Cascade Head. His wonderful book about the view from Cascade Head. And I want to, coming back to the Stonewall Heceta Bank area, I mean, we're so lucky to have the Cummins and Rock Creek Wilderness onshore and smack in between the designated marine reserves and marine protected areas. So it's just it's that connection, and that we're so lucky to have that, and we ought to recognize that. And I'll just say one last time, stuff from the bank goes north in the winter. It basically spreads the whole coast. You turn it around in the summer, and as we mentioned, those nutrients and fish and zooplankton are going offshore and feeding the California current. So if you come away with this idea that this very special place is connected both onshore and everywhere up and down the coast.
Thanks, Jack and Paul. Bruce says hello. And Bruce Byers, by the way, gave a great presentation for the Cape Perpetua Collaborative, I think a week or so ago. And there's a recording of that available. So happy to send that out to folks. I want to go back to merlets a little bit because we're getting some questions about them. And I'm gonna try to take a stab at some of these too, because I know a little bit about merlets. Is the marbled merlet listed as endangered? Matthew responded saying they are federally listed as threatened, which is true. They're also listed at the state level in Oregon as threatened, and Portland Audubon and a number of other groups are working on trying to get them uplisted to endangered. Would help strengthen protections around them for a number of reasons, which I could elaborate more on, but probably not tonight. But the other question is related to merlets is, please describe the research on the survival rates of baby merlets. And I know that's really tricky because merlets are a really cool seabird in that they breed in large old growth and mature trees, which are really hard to find. The first nest discovered in Oregon, I think Paul was part of that, was like not that long ago, like in the 80s or maybe 70s. But then I know that a lot of folks that do the at-sea surveys like Lindsay does look at the ratios of juveniles and adults to get at survivorship. But I will go ahead and let Lindsay elaborate much more on that.
Sure. And actually the first nest in Oregon was found in the 90s. So even more recently than you thought. So our project this is exactly what our project is hoping to figure out is what these birds need to be successful in their nesting efforts. And so we have so far been searching for nests for 3 years, 2017, 2018, and 2019. Unfortunately, we couldn't do field work in 2020 because of COVID, but we're hoping to get back out there again this year. And our project is unique in that we are nest searching really hard. These birds can nest, you know, tens of meters above the forest floor in these huge old trees. So it's quite an effort for us to find them, but we track them using radio telemetry. And we do that with a fleet of technicians on the ground, driving up and down the coast, listening for the birds on the water. And then we also send an airplane up in the air when we think that a bird has gone inland. And when we find a nest from the plane, then we have to go in on the ground and actually pinpoint the tree. And we have a canopy biologist who is a tree climber who then has to actually go up and find that needle in the haystack, the little bird sitting on the branch to find the nest. But then once we have actually located a nest, we put up a nest camera, and we put that nest camera up in an adjacent tree. We have a massive zoom lens on that thing, and then we just watch that nest for the rest of the season. And so that's exactly the information that we're trying to find out, is how successful the nests are and what things are helping the birds to be successful or causing them not to be successful. And so as Joe mentioned, these are really difficult to find. And so over those 3 years, we have only found 12 nests so far, but that's actually a huge number because prior to that, only about 30 nests had been found when they were active. So when they had an egg or a chick still in them. So we're increasing the overall sample size of known nests of these birds quite a bit. And out of the 12 nests that we have found, I believe 5 of them fledged a chick. And these birds only lay one egg, so there's only one shot to get a chick out. So still, that's a low sample size so far, but we fledged more chicks than we expected. So that's pretty exciting.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'm tempted to ask more questions about birds, but I'm going to restrain myself a bit. Here's an interesting question, though, for someone maybe more on the physical science side. I've always been curious why there isn't a trench in the Cascadia subduction zone. Is it just filled up with sediments and debris? Does anyone know?
Well, if Chris Goldfinger was here, he'd tell you that that subducting Pacific plate is acting like a snow shovel that's pushing the sediment up. And so rather than a trench dropping away, it's actually building up that material that forms the slope and the coastal range.
Thanks, Jack. This is a question from Don Lyons. Oh, Don's joining. Is there any cultural memory of the offshore banks and the traditions of any Oregon tribes in origin stories or other reservoirs of knowledge? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
This is such a great question. I have no idea.
Hey, Don, we'll bring that to Lauren Davis and get back to you on that one.
I will say that in researching the project, we did ask around and try to find something and didn't turn anything up. That doesn't mean that isn't the case, but we weren't able to find one in producing the film. But some of the longest oral tradition, cultural memory goes back, of course, to the Klamath people in Mount Mazama and that sort of thing. It's one of the oldest recorded in the world. Usually that fizzles out after 500 years, in terms of an oral tradition. So it could very well be, given that a nearby people had that in their memory. So maybe someday we'll turn it up on some project in the future.
Thanks, David and Jack. Annie, can you tell us a little bit more? I really want to learn more about the squids because I like squids. And I know that I thought I remember reading somewhere that you've discovered some new species. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So, you know, my research background, I've really been very interested in my entire career in how all of the different kinds of squids are related. There are about 600 or so species. It turns out when they evolved early on, they got a little bit of a start before fishes. So they really were able to radiate and take advantage quite a bit of the open ocean. And so, you know, that idea that they've been able to rapidly expand, coupled with the vast size of the ocean, means that effectively every time we go and drop a net into the ocean, regardless really of where we go, inevitably we find something that you pull up and you go, well, that's not anything I know how to identify. That's weird. Or that's not the size it should be, or this shouldn't be here. So, you know, the percentage of the ocean that we've really studied below about, you know, that sort of photic zone is extremely small. So, you know, it's quite easy, honestly, to find new species. The species off of our coast are really pretty fantastic because they're not quite the same kind of squids that we find off of California. They're not quite the same kind that we find off of Alaska. So, you know, all of this work that's sort of talking about this really fantastic oceanographic system that we have along our coast sets up a really unique body of open ocean animals, squids and fishes, that really are critical components of this larger ecosystem, from, you know, feeding seabirds to feeding salmon. And a lot of these animals are moving in and out across the bank at different times to feed, to reproduce at different life history stages. So there's some really fantastic connectivity that ties this whole area together.
I want to make a comment here. I spent several cruises on Japanese vessels, gill netting vessels in the North Pacific. And what I did on most of the cruises was study the feeding habits of salmonids. And oftentimes, the only thing we find in stomach contents are euphausids. Other times, many times, squid were the dominant prey. Mostly dennated squids. You open up the stomach, but they have a lot of goodness, and it's just oily. It's an oily mass. They're very high productivity, nutrient-rich food. So they're always selected by, I think, fishes like salmon if they can get them.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And I did describe one new species of squid, Dennatus ananicus. You ever heard of that one, Gladys?
Oh yeah, I have some of those in my lab. I didn't realize that the Percy on the name was yours though. So yeah. I know there's a, you know, it's always Percy, but I didn't realize it was you. So I've learned something new right now on this panel. So excellent.
I have a question for Bill from the panel or from the participants. Can we establish a long-term monitoring system to document future changes? And what are the challenges with that in terms of funding and agency support?
Well, that's a question for Jack too. But other states have ash marine sanctuaries off the coast, Washington, California. We have none. And I advocated for this many years ago for Heceta Bank, Heceta Bank. And what we found out right away is there's a lot of resistance from fishermen. Even though a national marine sanctuary has nothing to do with regulating fisheries, but what it does do is good is it would eliminate any kind of drilling or offshore platforms or something like that on the bank, but it doesn't regulate fishing. That's done by the council. Nevertheless, at that time, maybe things have changed, but there was a lot of resistance to a national marine sanctuary off the Oregon coast. And for that reason, the whole thing was dropped by NOAA. And so that would be something that would take some political convincing, and a lot of people on the coast would have to be convinced that this would be a good thing. And if you got something like that, at least in other states, that offers money. In some cases, some states have research vessels that are dedicated to their national marine sanctuaries. And that would be a way to get long-term studies going on the bank that everybody says we need to look at long-term changes in physical characteristics, temperature, oxygen levels. And I think that would be excellent because the offshore bank at Heceta is going to be different probably from the inshore, basically like Cape Perpetua. That's why it would be good to have this extended strip, inshore, offshore, to look at this gradient and the ecological interactions between offshore and inshore. So a lot of good reasons for doing it. Funding is going to be a problem.
Jack, do you have anything to add, or anyone?
Well, I'll just chime in. The question was also about how do we build an observing network out there, and maybe we'll do another film, but there's another hidden wonder offshore, and that's the Ocean Observatories Initiative funded by the National Science Foundation. So there actually are a couple of big underwater measurement platforms that measure the physics and the chemistry, and they've got acoustics and some cameras connected with a cable to shore. They're a little bit north of the bank. We have 80 meters of water near Stonewall Bank, and then one at 500 meters out in that area that Annie works, where there's that oxygen minimum zone, just on the outside of the northern part of the bank. But it basically gives us a internet connection out to an undersea lab. And you can find out about it on the web, take a peek what's going on out there. And then lastly, I think this partnership with the fishermen, and perhaps Amanda could talk a little bit about this. I mean, that's really the way to go with getting boats out there and getting measurements from working with the fishermen. Amanda, you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I think the point around collaborative research, we have a whole fleet of boats that are going out basically every day off our coast and leveraging those as research platforms and working directly with fishermen to engage them in all stages of the research, I think is really critical to making that a success. Fishermen are excellent observers. I mean, they are paying attention because their livelihood depends on it. And so I think they're a great resource for identifying emerging issues and phenomena, things that are coming up that they're seeing that are different than what they've seen before, and can help really inform where we go with research questions around long-term monitoring, as well as be part of that data collection effort. There's been some great examples of that. So getting temperature and oxygen sensors in crab pots, and working with fishermen to do some of our fisheries surveys. So there's definitely some successes that I think we can continue to build on. And I would just highlight that, especially the Newport fleet, because Hatfield is right there, there's really good relationships between the researchers and the fishing community. And I don't know, Lindsay, you probably have some experience. Didn't you guys charter a fishing vessel to do some of your work?
Yeah, more than one. We've used quite a few. We use OSU's research vessels, but we've also had to use just regular, fishing boats. And I don't think we pay as well as fishing does, but there are captains out there who are really interested in helping out. And Selena Happel mentions in the film that fishermen are better at catching fish than researchers are. And I would add to that and say they are also better at finding birds. We owe a lot of the success of our project to the captains that we work with, because they just know the water so well. And, they make note of things that we are just totally blind to, like, oh, we were successful at catching birds on this particular night, and they know exactly why. Oh, well, that's because we were over this undersea mount, and just everything. It's amazing. They're really excellent research partners.
I might mention something else. The area west of Heceta Bank is probably the most productive area for fisheries in Oregon. And that was closed for a long time, rockfish conservation area. You could correct me if I'm wrong on some of these things. And it was opened up, I think, in 2020. So the people are fishing there now. So Waldo Wakefield
Oh, looks like Bill froze. Hopefully he'll come back. Y'all hear me? Okay. Well, while Bill is frozen, let's move on to another question, but I do want to give the 10-minute, kind of a 10-minute warning here. We're gonna end the event in about 10 minutes. We still do have over 130 people logged in, which is great, and there's still time for questions, so we'll try to get to them, but I do want to let y'all know that we will be wrapping it up at 8:30. Now it looks like Bill may have been kicked off, but maybe he can rejoin. But let's just, one thing I want to say is that one of the attendees did say that as a former NOAA National Marine Sanctuaries employee, he said that would be the best tool, in his opinion, to ensure long-term monitoring and assessments, as these are a mandate of all sanctuaries in the program. I wonder if anyone can elaborate on that comment. Paul, anybody?
Well, that is what I didn't see the attendee's name, but what he said is accurate. And a commitment, we tried to move down. There was a number of us, Bill and a number of us tried to move forward with the marine sanctuary designation and discussion, but there was significant pushback and the political climate was different. And so making another run at that may make sense. And so interested, they should probably contact Jack and myself and Bill and have a dialogue.
Great. Does anyone know if National Marine Sanctuaries can be designated through administrative action, or does it take an act of Congress? We'll have to look that up. Maybe Don Lyons is asking that.
Yeah, I'm remembering that Papahānaumokuākea was an executive action, I believe. So
Right.
I'm just going off of memory. Maybe Paul has a more.
Nope, that was right. Huge.
Okay, cool. Let's see. I want to get and ask a question here for Dave. What was the most interesting thing you discovered while making this documentary?
For me, it was going through just the old footage and slides, working with Bill and his contacts that he's had over the past, 50 years of research. There's just a treasure trove of archival material, and that's always super exciting when you get a box of old slides or some old videos or VHS tapes. Not many people get to go to these places. I mean, when you're, that far deep, you can't dive that far. You need some sort of vehicle to get down there, and it's a big undertaking. The other thing that was exciting, one of our crew was able to tag along on a Nautilus cruise. So a lot of that footage came from submersibles on that research vessel. And the technology is getting better, so the images are sharper and clearer. But I think most of the sea life that we saw are in those old dive videos from the 80s. So I'd be curious to see what it would have been like then if we had the technology that we have now on some of the dives that Bill was able to make.
Thanks, David. Do any of the panelists have any questions they want to ask each other? I want to give a chance for people to have some interaction on the panel themselves.
I'm curious if people just have cool stories of time spent out on the bank and just cool things that you saw out there. I want to hear some just fun stories.
Well, I'm fortunate enough to take OSU classes and Linfield College and local activists, policy people out in the field from the top of Cape Perpetua. We start the field trip. And one day, Don Lyons, one of the attendees here this evening, had his class, I believe it was his class, come on up. And in their classroom, they were talking about forage fish. From the top of the Cape, what do you see but a bait ball? And the feeding frenzy was happening, and it couldn't have been a better field experience to ground truth what they were talking about at the Marine Science Center. So I really feel fortunate to be able to have a classroom at the top of the Cape.
My story is out on one of the big research vessels, and I'm the physics guy. So we're making our measurements, and I decided to take a break out on the fantail, just walk out there and look at the view. And this enormous humpback whale came and went under the boat, came back up and blew its spout and just coated us in all the smelly crap that you could possibly think of. And I said, what am I doing here? I'm a physicist. I'm supposed to be clean. So it's really an amazing place.
I guess I can share a story. I think for me, the opportunity to take undergraduates out to sea for the first time and watch their faces as we pull up the net and what, the kinds of animals that we were able to pull up was really fantastic. I think one of my favorite moments was in one of the nets samples that we pulled up, there was an anglerfish. And I had never seen an anglerfish aside from in pictures or videos, but I'm staring at this fish from around 800 meters, and it's the blackest color of black I've ever seen. And I know that I am one of 3 people in the whole world that's ever seen this particular anglerfish live. And my students get to see this. And so we're having this cathartic moment. And then someone said, oh my God, there's dolphins. And all the students ran outside to look at the dolphins. And I was there with my anglerfish. Yeah, anyway.
Nice. Well, I think we're a couple minutes from 8:30. I think it's probably a good time to wrap it up. And I think that was that last question, just from nice stories out there from you folks, is a good way to end it. So I'm going to just say from Portland Audubon, we're really happy to have helped get this event off the ground. And thanks to all the panelists, thanks to all the folks that attended, and we still have over 100 people on there listening in. So thanks for everything. And I want to pass off to Jack just to kind of wrap it up for OSU, and then we'll end it after that, right after Jack's done.
Appreciate all the panelists, all the attendees. And I think I saw in the chat, how do we get the story out there? And this is our way of telling the story, but we're relying on you now to spread the word and tell your neighbors and take a look at the film, and most importantly, get out to the coast, go up on Cape Perpetua and take a look at the wonder out there. So thank you and have a good evening.